class, I officially welcome you to school year 2021-2022 second semester. I will be your professor for parasitology. I am Ms. Lena Yvonne Huco, RMT. So for today, we will be discussing about your Module 1, which is the Introduction to Parasitology. Just to give you a brief idea of this subject, this is actually one of my most favorite subjects. So I hope that you will enjoy this subject as much as I do. And a few reminders before you start watching this video lecture. Number 1, please do take down notes. A PDF copy or a soft copy of the presentation has been added to Google Classroom already for your reference. Second is listen attentively, avoid unnecessary distractions. And third, alam nyo naman na to, give extra attention to information marked with a star. If you will be seeing a star anywhere in the PowerPoint, it means it may be a recall question in the board exam. So since parasitology is actually one of the major board exam subject or one of the minor board exam subject, so uulan po ng star sa buong duration ng parasitology natin. So learning objectives for Module 1. Define common terms related to parasitology. Explain the host-parasite relationships. Explain the different classifications of the parasites according to their habitat, its effects to the host, mode of development, mode of living, and the type of offspring. Also discuss the different classification of the host and the vectors. And discuss the factors affecting the transmission of these parasites. Okay, introduction to parasitology. This is the science that deals with the study of living organisms that depends on another organism for the purpose of procuring food and securing protection. These organisms, which are usually smaller and weaker than the other organism, are known as parasites. So yung parasitology nga, in a broad sense, it means na study of parasites. Diba kasi yung word na or yung term na logy is the study of. And then parasi, which is coming from the term parasite. So pag pinagsama parasitology, it means the study of the parasites. And these parasites, it is, sabi daw, usually smaller and weaker in comparison with the other organism. So dito kasi sa parasitology, there are two main parang characters. Okay, it is the host and the parasites. So, si host, pwede nating sabihin ito yung humans, so tayo yun, or yung mga animals natin. At yung mga parasites natin, yun yung mga uod, yung mga pag-uusapan natin all throughout the semester. So, usually, yung mga parasites daw is yung weaker or yung mas maliit. Actually, nga ang ating mga parasites, most of the time, are microscopic sila. Hindi nyo siya nakikita basta-basta without the aid of the microscope. At ito pong mga parasites na ito, most of the time, they depend on the host or the other organism, again, for the procuring of the food. So, para may nutrition sila and also securing the protection. And ito pong nakikita nyo yung breakdown dito sa ating right side, this is actually the breakdown dun sa ating board exam. So, just to give you a brief idea, in the board exam, meron pong 2 days yon. So, you will take the board exam for 2 days. The first day and the second day will consist of 3 subjects each. Okay? So, again, yung 2 days na yon, it will consist of 3 subjects each. Yung micropara, which consists of the parasitology, you will take this in the first day of the board exam. And also, yung parasitology po, ano siya, parang nako-combine siya with microbiology. Yung micropara, magkasama po yan, 100 items. It is the second subject that you will take in the first day of the board exam. Okay, so second subject to. Yung second subject na yun, it will consist of 70% microbiology and 30% nun is eto na nga po, yung ating parasitology. So, malaki pong percentage yan in the 100 items exam. So, although 30% lang siya, mas malaki pa rin si micro, it is vital that your foundation here is good. Okay? Because itong parasitology, very interesting na subject to. Medyo madali dito magkabisaduhan kasi interesting talaga yung subjects niya and basta parang maganda siya kasi pakinggan yung mga parasites dito. Mas madali siyang maalala in comparison with bacteriology. But of course, that depends on case-to-case basis. It depends on the person. But still, a good foundation in parasitology is vital for you in the board exam. So sana, serious talaga natin itong subject na to. Okay? Okay, so let's go ahead with the definition of terms. Of course, the parasitology, again, is the study of the parasites and parasitism. So, ano naman po ibig sabihin ng parasitism? Parasitism is a symbiotic relationship where one organism, a parasite, lives on or on another organism, which is the host, for the survival and usually at the expense of the latter. So, what does this mean? So, here daw in parasitism, merong two main characters. The first character here is the parasite, and the second one is the host. Usually, this parasite lives in the host. So, pwedeng nasa loob or on, nasa labas. Usually, this parasite infects a host for its survival mismo. So, para mabuhay siya. And it is usually at the expense of the latter. Ibig sabihin kasi, class, ng expense is na-harm niya. Pwede niyang ma-harm or it can cause harm to the host. Okay, so again, what is parasitism? It is a symbiotic relationship where one organism, which is known as a parasite, lives on or on another organism, which is the host, for the survival, para mabuhay, and usually at the expense of the latter. So that is parasitism. But there are also other types of symbiotic relationship. Aside from parasitism, we have mutualism, wherein both organisms benefit from each other. Because if you will be comparing parasitism versus mutualism, kay parasitism kasi naha-harm niya yung isa. It can cause harm. While in mutualism, both of the organisms benefit from each other. So, pareha silang may pakinabang sa isa't isa. Yun po yung mutualism. Also, we have a symbiotic relationship known as your commensalism, wherein one benefits but the other is neither helped nor harmed. So again, commensalism, the first character benefits from the other. However, the other one is neither helped nor harmed. So, wala lang siyang pake. Okay, yung isa lang po yung merong benefit. While the other one, again, is hindi naman niya naha-harm, but hindi rin naman siya nagbe-benefit from it. So, yun po ang commensalism. So, here is the comparison of mutualism versus commensalism. Classification of parasite. Number 1, we can classify the parasites according to the habitat of the parasite. So, kung saan nyo siya natatagpuan. We have here the endoparasite. Endo meaning it is the parasite living inside the host. Kaya nga po siya endo. Diba? Ibig sabihin ng endo, inside. While your ectoparasites, which is the parasites which are living outside the host. I repeat, classify the parasite according to the habitat. Endo, meaning inside. So, endoparasites or those parasites living inside the host. While your ectoparasites, ecto meaning outside, ectoparasites now are the parasites living outside the host. A good example, class, of the endoparasites is yung ating mga common na bulate. Like yung sa mga bata, di ba, pag sinabing, uy, meron kang bulate sa tiyan. So, of course, yung tiyan natin, class, nasa loob ng katawan natin yun. So, that is a type of endoparasite. A good example naman of an ectoparasite, sige, sabihin natin, is kuto. Kuto or lice. Ang kuto natin, right, it is living outside our body, di ba? Nasa hair natin siya. So, nasa labas ng ating katawan. So, that is a good example of an ectoparasite in humans, yung kuto or lice. Also, we can classify the parasites according to the effect to the host. So, the parasite can either be a pathogenic one, which causes injury by its mechanical, traumatic, or toxic activities. Or basically, pag sinabi kasing pathogenic, it can cause disease. While the non-pathogenic parasite derives benefit from the host without causing any considerable damage or harm. Although it can cause naman something na or somehow it can cause a reaction in the body, but still it is not considerable na malaki or it can affect the whole system. So parang ganun si non-pathogenic. So in layman's term, pag pathogenic, nagkukos ng sakit. Pag non-pathogenic, hindi nagkukos ng sakit. Also, classification of parasite, it can also classify them according to the mode of the development. May star dito, pero sige, dito muna tayo. Obligate. Obligate parasites are those parasites that requires a host to complete its developmental cycle or life stages. So, ito pong mga different parasites na to give you an idea. They are undergoing developmental cycle or the life cycle. Iisa-isahin natin plus yung life cycle ng mga different parasites natin as the semester goes along. But for now, it is good for you to know that there are obligate parasites wherein this parasite actually requires a host to survive or to complete its life cycle or stages in life. So, kapag sinabi kasi obligate, di ba, obligado. So, obligate, mga obligadong parasite na merong host. Kasi kung wala silang host, hindi matutuloy yung kanilang life cycle. Okay? Or pwede mamamatay pa nga sila, pwede rin. So, those are obligate parasites. Here, next, facultative. This is the recall question in the board exam. Please do take note of this. A good example of a facultative parasite is the Strongyloides stercoralis. What does this mean, yung facultative? These are parasites that can be free-living or become parasitic. So, ang ibig sabihin po, pag facultative, ang ating isang parasite, it can complete its life cycle without the host. It can be free-living in the environment. So, pwede siyang, nandyan lang siya sa tubig, nandyan lang siya sa lupa, mako-complete yung life cycle niya kahit walang host. Okay, a good example again of that is the Strongyloides stercoralis. Please do take note. Again, this is the recall question in the board exam. I repeat, this is the recall question in the board exam. What is a good example of a facultative parasite? That is your Strongyloides stercoralis. Hindi lang po ito ang ating facultative. Marami po sila. But ito po yung naitanong sa board exam. Okay, so again, please do take note of this. Also, we can classify the parasites according to the mode of living. So, nandun na nga po yung obligate, di ba? Obligado sila na meron silang host. While the facultative can either be free-living or parasitic existence under favorable or appropriate circumstances. They can have a host or without a host, and they can complete their life cycle. Also, we have the accidental or incidental parasites, which are those parasites that establishes itself to a host where it does not ordinarily live. So, aksidente nga lang, accidental. So, itong parasite na ito, yung mga accidental parasites natin, hindi siya dapat nandoon sa host na yon. Okay? So, parang kumbaga naligaw lang siya. But still, kahit naligaw lang si parasite, na-infect niya yung host natin. Okay? But commonly, in the life cycle, hindi dapat kasama yung host na to dun sa life cycle ni parasite. Those are accidental or incidental parasites. Also, we also have the permanent parasites. Parasites that remains in the host for its entire life. A good example of this is filarial worms. So, ang filarial worms natin, once na na-infect to, or once na ka-infection ng humans, mahirap na po siyang tanggalin sa ating system. Because again, the filarial worms, a good example of a permanent parasite. So, your whole life nandun na tong mga filarial worms na to. Okay? And then, we also have your temporary parasite, which are parasites that remains in the host for only a short period of time. Kaya nga po siya temporary lang. And we also have the sporious, or also known as your coprozoic parasites. These are free-living organisms that passes through the digestive tract of the host without infecting the host itself. So, kumbaga, nakidaan lang siya sa digestive system ng ating host. But it does not infect yung host natin. So, kung sa tao, kung papipiliin ka, di ba, kung permanent or temporary, of course, class, kapag sa tao, gusto natin mga permanent sa buhay natin. Ayaw natin ng mga temporary na pasaglit lang, gano'n, sasaktan lang tayo. But kung sa mga parasites class, piliin na lang natin si temporary lang. At least saglit lang siya sa katawan natin. Then, gagaling na tayo. Unlike kung permanent si parasite, forever na siya, nasa system natin. Diba? So, yun. So, kung parasite, doon lang tayo sa temporary. Pero kung tao, of course, doon tayo class sa permanent. Diba? So, it remains in our entire life. Okay, so ito po ang different classification ng parasites according to the mode of living. Next. We can also classify the parasites according to the type of their offspring. We can denote the term oviparous, wherein if the parasite produces an egg or ova. Kaya po siya ovi eh. Yung ovi kasi is ova. So, once a parasite is an oviparous one, ang napoproduce po nito is diretsong eggs or ova. Okay? So, mas mabivisualize nyo to, guys, kung nakakakita kayo ng life cycle. Explain naman natin yan as the time goes along. But for now, it is good for you to know that oviparous parasite are those parasites that produces eggs or ova. Yung eggs class ha, ova din po ang tawag doon, okay? With regards to the parasite. So, para hindi madaling makalimutan, ovi, ova, or egg. So, itong mga parasite na to, naglilay po siya ng egg or ova. While your viviparous or larviparous parasites, these are parasite that produces larva. Diba? Larva, larvae. Please do take note, a good example of the viviparous parasites is si Trichinella, your filarial worms, and Capillaria philippinensis or C. philippinensis. Please do take note, there is a recall question po dito sa ating Capillaria philippinensis. The Capillaria philippinensis can also be oviparous. So aside from larviparous siya, si Capillaria, it is also oviparous. It can either lay or produce egg or larva na agad-agad. So please do take note of this. This is a recall question. Again, what is the recall question? Which of the following can be oviparous or larviparous? Then, a good example of that class is si Capillaria philippinensis. Capillaria philippinensis can produce both egg or ova and larva. Next, we have now the classification of the host. So, kanina ang classify natin is si parasite. Okay? Ito namang classification na ng host natin mismo. Okay, we have the term here definitive and intermediate host. Once we say a host is the definitive host, this is the host on which the parasite attains sexual maturity. I repeat, the definitive host is the host on which the parasite attains sexual maturity. Okay? Then, an intermediate host naman is a host which harbors the larval stages of the parasite or asexual. Okay, nandito po yung asexual stage. Yun po yung intermediate host. So, kabisaduhin na lang, definitive sexual maturity. Mga mature na to. Mga malalaki na. Pag intermediate host naman, siya yung nag-harbor ng larval stage ng parasite which are asexual. Okay, so ito pa po ang more differences ng definitive versus the intermediate host. The definitive host are organisms that support the sexual reproductive form of the parasite. So basically, kapag merong definitive host, since sexual production or sexual maturity, pwedeng present dito is both male and female. Okay? And the definitive host is also known as your primary host. And sexual reproduction of the parasite again occurs here because this is where the parasite reaches its sexual maturity. And the formation of the zygote occurs here kasi nga po nagkakaroon ng sexual na interaction. And a good example of a definitive host is the definitive host of Plasmodium, which is the female Anopheles mosquito. So yun po ang definitive host ng ating Plasmodium na parasite. Intermediate hosts are organisms that support the immature or non-reproductive forms of the parasite. So, larval stages nga po yan. The intermediate host is also known as your secondary host. This is where the asexual reproduction of the parasite occurs. Sexual differentiation of the parasite occurs here. A good example of this is the intermediate host of Plasmodium as well, which is your humans. Please do take note po ha, magkaiba po ang definitive host at intermediate host ng ating Plasmodium. Ang definitive host niya po kung saan na-attain ang sexual maturity ni Plasmodium, nangyayari po yan sa loob ng female Anopheles mosquito. While the intermediate host of the Plasmodium is the humans. So that is the difference between the definitive and the intermediate host. Also, we also have a different classification pa ng ating host aside sa definitive tsaka sa intermediate. We have the paratenic host in which the parasite does not develop further to later stages, but the parasite is kept alive and is capable of infecting other susceptible hosts. So basically, when we say that certain host is paratenic, it can harbor the parasite inside of them. Okay? However, the development of the life stages does not occur. So, hanggang ditong stage lang siya, hanggat nandito siya sa loob ng paratenic host. However, the parasite does not die. Hindi siya namamatay kahit hindi siya nagde-develop into a later stage. It is still kept alive, hindi lang siya lumalaki or hindi lang siya nagde-develop. But still, inside the paratenic host, the parasite is alive. Hindi lang nagde-develop yung late life stages niya, but it is still capable of infecting another susceptible host. So, kumbaga kasi si paratenic host, sasakyan lang siya, hindi niya dine-develop si parasite. However, buhay pa rin si parasite at kaya niya pa rin mag-infect ng other susceptible host. That is a paratenic host. We also have class your reservoir host. These are animal hosts other than the definitive host that can allow the continuation of the life cycle and become additional sources of infection, which almost always ang reservoir host natin are animals. Okay, kaya nga siya reservoir, kumbaga parang reserve. Reserve na host to na other than the definitive host, kaya niyang i-continue yung life cycle and can become additional sources of infection. A good example of our reservoir host of our schistosomes, which are a type of parasite. Ang definitive host po ng ating schistosomes are humans, so tayo. But the carabaos, ito po, can serve as the reservoir host of schistosomes. And also, we have your carrier host. These are hosts that harbors a particular pathogen without manifesting any signs and symptoms. So, basically, pag sinabi na ikaw ay isang carrier ka lang. Wala kang simptomas, wala kang signs and symptoms, but you still harbor the parasite. So, that is what is a carrier. So, again, paratenic. Meron kang parasite but hindi nagde-develop yung stages. Reservoir, meron kang parasite at nagde-develop ang life stages here. A good example of a reservoir host is your carabao, which is the reservoir host of your schistosomes. And yung carrier, pag ikaw ay isang carrier, wala kang signs and symptoms but meron ka pa ring parasite. Next, vector. I can clearly remember the vector being discussed during CPH. But, reviewin lang natin what is a vector. Vector is responsible for transmitting the parasite from one host to another. So, kumbaga, itong mga vector na to, siya yung sasakyan ng mga parasites natin from one host to another. It is capable or responsible for the transmission. Vector can be categorized into two. Number one is your mechanical or phoretic vector, which again transports the parasite, but there is no development of the parasitic cycle or the life cycle. So, mechanical again or phoretic vector, no development of the parasitic cycle. A good example of your mechanical or phoretic vector is your cockroach. Ayan, si Apis. Si cockroach po is a mechanical vector of your ascaris. We also have the biological vector wherein it transmits the parasite after the completion of its development inside the host. It is necessary for the completion of its life cycle kapag ikaw po ay isang biological host or vector. A good example of a biological vector is your mosquitoes, which are the biological vector for malaria and filaria. So basically, ang nangyayari po, inside the mosquito, there will be the development of the life cycle of the malaria and filaria. So that is the difference of a mechanical and biological vector. Please do take note. Also additional, please do add this in your notes, additional information. Clinical incubation period. Clinical incubation period is the period between the acquisition of the parasite and the evidence of the symptoms. So, pwede nating sabihin na yung clinical incubation period ng isang parasite is like this. From the exposure or the acquisition of the parasite, hanggang sa mag-show ka ng signs and symptoms mo. That is the clinical incubation period. I repeat, clinical incubation period is the period between the acquisition or the exposure of the parasite from the parasite and the evidence of signs and symptoms. So basically, simula nung time na na-expose ka hanggang sa mag-show ka ng signs and symptoms, that is known as the clinical incubation period. Okay, next, biological incubation period. This is the period between the acquisition of the parasite, so na-expose, and the demonstration of the infection. It is also known as the pre-patent period. Please do take note that this is a recall question in the board exam. I repeat, pre-patent period is also known as your biological incubation period. Please do take note, this is a recall question. Highlightan natin itong other name ng ating biological incubation period. So ito naman po, sa ating biological incubation period, this is from the point of exposure or na-acquire mo si parasite hanggang sa ma-diagnose ka or the demonstration of infection. Ito pong demonstration of infection na to, andito na po papasok yung mga laboratory test na gagawin natin para ma-diagnose natin si patient na meron siyang ganitong parasite. Okay? So, kung pagko-compare nyo kasi siya sa clinical incubation, hanggang mag-show ka lang ng signs and symptoms. So, pwedeng sumasakit na yung tiyan mo, nagtatae ka, yun yung signs and symptoms. But the biological incubation period, dito na yung hanggang sa ma-diagnose ka natin using laboratory test or the demonstration of the infection. So, again, the biological incubation period is also known as your pre-patent period. Okay, next topic here, factors affecting transmission of your parasites. Sources of exposure to infection may be coming from, number 1, your soil-transmitted group or the STH or the soil-transmitted helminths. Requires further development in the soil before they become infective. So, kaya siya soil-transmitted. It requires yung presence ng soil before they can become infective. So, basically, itong mga STH natin, kailangan madaan muna po ito sa lupa bago siya maging infective, okay? A good example of the STH is Ascaris lumbricoides, Trichuris, Trichura, and your hookworms, and etc. pa. Ito lang po yung pinaka-common. Okay? Iisa-isahin natin yan, class. Huwag kayong mag-alala. Don't become overwhelmed with the names. Iisa-isahin po natin sila as the semester goes along. Next, your snail-transmitted group requires further development within the body of the snail. Kaya siya snail-transmitted. The snail which serves as the intermediate host before they become infective. A good example of this is for your flukes or our trematodes. Most trematodes require a snail as its intermediate host para mag-development yung life cycle niya. Third is your arthropod transmitted group. Some species of insects acts as a vector of parasitic diseases such as mosquitoes, sandfly, and tsetse-fly. Ayan, mga narinig nyo na yan sa CPH, yung sandfly tsaka tsetse-fly na yan. Those are arthropod transmitted groups. These are parasites po na requires insects. Yun yung arthropods kasi mga insects yan, class. A good example of the vectors na arthropod is yung mosquitoes nyo, sandfly, and tsetsefly. Mga vectors po yan. At yung mga kinikerry nilang disease or parasites are under the arthropod transmitted group. You also have the animal or food transmitted group, requires further development in the flesh of some animals that man can consume. A good example of this animal or food transmitted group is your Trichinella spiralis and Taenia solium, while eating raw beef may be sources of Taenia saginata. Itong Trichinella at si Taenia solium po, nakukuha ito sa pagkain po ng raw na pork. While the Taenia saginata, most of the time, sources niya po is raw beef. So, kung kayo po medyo mahilig po kayo kumain ng mga raw, yan, yung mga kulang sa luto na pagkain. Be careful because those raw na mga food consumptions can harbor parasites po. Okay? Then we also have the contact transmitted group. Person-to-person transmission wherein the parasite requires no further development and are readily infective. A good example of the contact transmitted group is your Enterobius vermicularis and Trichomonas vaginalis. Si Enterobius vermicularis po, ang kanyang mode of transmission is direct contact pwede. And also inhalation. So, contact din yun, di ba? And si Trichomonas vaginalis po can be transmitted sexually. So, contact din, di ba? Ang sexual interaction is also a type of contact between person to person. And also, ito self-sabotage to yung oneself or auto-infection. The infected person is his own source of re-exposure. There are two types of auto-infection which can be either external or internal. So, sige, bigay tayo ng auto-infection examples. Auto-infection results when an infected individual becomes his own direct source of infection. Ito nga, self-sabotage to. So, ikaw, sa sarili mo, ang naging another source of infection kung bakit ka nagkasakit ulit. Okay? This is also known as self-infection. Kasi nga po, yung meaning ng auto sa medical term is self. So, auto-infection is self-infection. It can either be external or internal. A good example of the parasite harboring an external auto-infection or possible external auto-infection is your Enterobius vermicularis, Taenia solium, and H. nana at C. parvum. Please do take note of this. These parasites can be a potential source of external auto-infection. Again, that is ETHC, again, ETHC, E for Enterobius vermicularis, T for T. solium or Taenia solium, H. nana, Hymenoleucis nana, and Cryptosporidium parvum, C. parvum. It can either be auto-infection, can also be internal po. A good example of that is your Strongyloides and Capillaria philippinensis. Both of these parasites are capable of internal auto-infection. Diba? Pati yung yung mga parasite matatalino no? Nagsa-self-sabotage pa. Kasi ikaw mismo ang naging direct source ng reinfection mo. So, please do take note at pakikabisado po ang mga parasites na merong external at internal auto-infection. Okay, so this is a different term. Iba po yung auto-infection sa co-infection. Co-infection results when an already infected individual is concurrently further infected with another species of parasite. So, eto, meron ka na ngang sakit, may isa ka na ngang parasite, nagkaroon ka pa ng another species. So, that is co-infection. A good example of our co-infection is yung ating unholy trinity or unholy three. Yan, kami ang pabebe worms. Para makabisado po yan, you can use this, yung HAT. HAT is for hookworms, A is ascaris, and T is for trichuris. Please do take note, this is a recall question in the board exam. I repeat, this is a recall question in the board exam. Ano daw po yung unholy trinity? It can cause co-infection. So, pwede yan hookworm, ascaris, trichuris, HAT. unholy tree, hat, unholy tree, hat. Hat for hookworm, ascaris, and trichuris. So basically, pag sinabing co-infection, etong tatlong to, pwede kang ma-infect ng sabay-sabay. Okay? So may hookworm ka na nga, may ascaris ka pa, may trichuris ka pa. Kinumpleto ang unholy trinity. So kami po ang pabebe worms. Ayan. So silang tatlo po yan. This can be a cause of co-infection. Personally, wala pa akong nakikilala or natitest sa laboratory na merong present ng tatlong to. But ang naranasan ko na is present both ascaris tsaka si hookworm. Okay? But ayoko naman. Hindi naman sa sinasabi kong gusto kong makakita ng isang taong merong tatlong to. Mahirap pong gamutin yan kasi tatlong parasite yan. So that is co-infection. Okay, and a brief review of the distribution of diseases for epidemiology. We have first is endemic, when disease is in a human population maintains a relatively steady or moderate level. So endemic siya doon sa area na yon. Wala tayong magagawa, talagang yun na yung numbers niya or yung number of cases niya in that specific area. We also have the epidemic if there is a sharp rise in the incidence or an outbreak of considerably intensity occurs. That is known as epidemic. So yung biglang pagtaas ng cases or ng case ng diseases na yon in that particular area, that is epidemic. While a hyperendemic if the prevalence of a disease in a community is high. So, in that particular community kasi, pag sinabi kasing endemic, kumbaga parang normal siya na present sa area na yon. However, if that particular case na normal in that area biglang tumaas, that is hyperendemic. Next is sporadic. Sporadic if it appears only occasionally in one or at most few members of a community. So, paisa-isa lang. That is sporadic. While your pandemic is the disease covers extensive area of the world, which is a good example is the COVID-19. Declared na pandemic. So, worldwide siya. And then, here are the mode of transmission or the portal of entry of most common parasites. First is through skin penetration. So, sa skin, nag-penetrate siya. A good example of parasites with skin penetration is Strongyloides, your hookworms, and your schistosoma. So, mag-ingat po ha, yung mga nagpapaa, yung mga nakapaalagi, ayan, kasi pwede pong mag-skin penetrate itong mga parasite na ito. Yan. Lalo na doon sa mga may lupa sa labas, tapos nag-aapak sila. So, ito po, pwede kayong ma-infect ng mga Strongyloides, hookworm, tsaka schistosoma just through skin penetration. So, mag-ingat po yung mga laging nakapaa sa labas. Also, we have the congenital or vertical transmission. We can also term this as transplacental transmission. So, from mother to child. Okay? That is congenital transmission, mother to child. A good example of parasites with congenital or vertical or transplacental transmission is your hookworms and toxoplasma. Also, inhalation. So, na-inhale. A good example of this is ating Enterobius vermicularis. That is a known parasite with inhalation as the mode of transmission. So, na-inhale natin si parasite, diba? Then, kung ini-imagine nyo siya, diba, parang medyo kadiri kasi na-inhale natin, diba, yung parasite mismo. Diba? So, yun nga, si Enterobius po yan. Very prevalent po yan na inhalation yung mode of transmission niya. We also have ingestion of contaminated food and water. Then, we also have the sexual or venereal route. Okay, life cycle. Ito po, iisa-isahin po natin ang different life cycle of the different parasites. But the life cycle is the development of the parasite, which involves the survival and development in the external environment and in one or more hosts. Yung mga parasites kasi natin, minsan, hindi lang isang host yung require niya para mag-develop siya. Minsan dalawa, minsan tatlo, and so on. And minsan naman din, hindi niya kailangan ng host. Just like the facultative parasites na diniscuss natin kanina. So, it really depends on the parasite. Iisa-isahin naman natin siya. Maganda lang alamin na yung life cycle is the parang stages of the development of the parasite. Maraming contributing factors dyan na iisa-isahin din natin. And also, we have your diagnosis. Although hindi naman natin typically concern yung clinical diagnosis, but yung laboratory diagnosis, ito talaga yung pinaka-concern natin. So, diagnosis has two main methods of approach. It can either be clinical. Pag clinical diagnosis, we are correlating the diagnosis based on the recognition of the characteristic signs and symptoms of the disease. Meron kasi yan, yung mga parasites natin, yung mga parasites kasi natin can manifest signs and symptoms kasi. And next is your laboratory diagnosis. Ito yung main concern natin. Okay, si lab diagnosis. This method is based on the identification of the parasite in the different specimens. So, madalas nga natin ginagawa dyan is yung fecalysis natin. Although, hindi lang naman yun yung ginagawa sa parasitology. Marami pa pong different tests na pwedeng gawin, but it is just the pinaka-common, yung fecalysis. Yun yung pinaka-concern natin with regards to the diagnosis. Ito kasing signs and symptoms, madalas naman mga doctors na yung nagko-correlate nito sa ating mga parasites. So, hindi natin siya main concern. Ito talaga yung concern natin, yung lab diagnosis. Also, what are the different host defenses? So, paano natin lalabanan si parasite? We have your phagocytes, which are your WBCs, neutrophils, monophytes that can turn into macrophage. We can also have your eosinophils and IgE. We can also have your IgM and IgG antibodies. Ito yung mga defense mechanism natin against the parasites. Treatment. Ito si treatment, hindi rin natin to pinaka-main concern kasi hindi naman po tayo yung nagbibigay ng gamot. But just so you know, the successful treatment of the infected patient includes the use of chemotherapeutic agents, surgical intervention. Minsan, yung mga gamot, ito po yung chemotherapeutic agent, hindi siya enough para mapatay si parasite. So, minsan, surgical intervention na ang kailangan. And of course, adequate nutrition. Minsan, hindi lang kasi healthy yung individual, kaya siya na-infect. And this three methods is used to build up general resistance against the parasites. Okay, thank you for listening. If you have any questions or clarifications, you may reach out to me through my messenger or our group chat and through this email.